Before we start the video, today's sponsor is The Big Shuffle, a film noir card game that is live on Kickstarter. The Big Shuffle is a film noir card game where you are trying to make your way in an uncaring city. This is a competitive 2 to 4 player game where you play as one of 6 classic film noir characters, such as the Private Eye, the Femme Fatale, and the Mafia Don. Each of these characters have their own win conditions and unique abilities to achieve their agenda. You have to play smart though, as it is easy for someone else to change a scene for their benefit also. Full of role-playing opportunities, The Big Shuffle pairs well with a cigar, whiskey, and smooth jazz. The Big Shuffle Kickstarter ends on January 9th, so if you want a unique game from the iconic American era of 1940s noir film, check them out today for Kickstarter exclusives. You'll find links in the description. And with that, on to today's video. Alright, it is 2022 and we're beginning the year with a brand new critical thought. Since I've been working on my free-to-play design block, for today's topic I want to talk about the PvP gameplay loop. Why this is a very popular option for many live service and free-to-play games, but how it can also come back to bite someone, and why for me it is why I'm just not enjoying Dead by Daylight anymore. Any live service game trying to stay afloat in the market has to think about long tail support and what does long-term gameplay look like. And this is why for most of the games out there, they will typically go with a PvP focus or PvP gameplay loop, which of course involves playing against people, whether it is 1v1, guilds, groups, whatever you want to do. The reasons why this is a very popular system to go for is that it once again brings to light the aspect of player-generated content, as in the player base itself is what is responsible for generating the content of the game. So when you're playing in PvP, as long as there's people on the server willing to play with, you have content. It is far, I guess I should say, easier to develop new elements for PvP than it is having to keep redesigning new storylines, new scripted missions, and you get far more value out of that. A new map in a PvP mode or a new character can bring hours and hours of new content or new impact on that game. A new 30-minute map or a new 30-minute storyline, that gets you 30 minutes. And probably sometimes less if people speedrun it. So this is why these games tend to focus on this style of loop. And the competitiveness of these games certainly doesn't hurt as well, as people can keep playing for rankings, additional rewards, or just simply to show off and say, I'm number 1 on the server. Now, with that said, the PvP gameplay loop is very much targeted towards people who have that mindset of playing games competitively. If we go back to the Bartle test, it is the category of killers. That you want to play against other people. You want to prove that you're the best. But that is only one segment of your consumer base. And one of the things that a lot of developers have struggled with over the last 10 years, and I'm sure will be in the next 10 years, is how do you build your community around as wide of a consumer base as possible? Because if you only focus on PvP, then you are eliminating a very huge part of a potential consumer base. This is why for many mobile style games that do feature PvP elements, they will have other systems. They'll have, daily maps you can play, hunting for resources, gotchas. There are additional systems and elements in place so that if you don't care about PvP or you only want to do just a little bit of it, the game still works for you. Now, for games that are entirely PvP driven, developers will implement additional systems to try and add another form of progression. This is where we see the act of prestiging, where you'll hit max level, you'll reset, but you'll gain a benefit, maybe a exclusive cosmetic, something to show off the fact that you did this whole song and dance of grinding before, and now you're doing it again. One element that does work, or at least can work in the short term, is having secondary missions and objectives. Again, many games will like to have daily quests or weekly quests, something that you can focus your playstyle on. Because again, the PvP loop in of itself is not going to be motivating to somebody who's not all in on it. And again, this is where we see the rise of loot boxes and cosmetics. Again, anything that you can tie the PvP to beyond just competitive play will work here. One of the things that I did like about Dead by Daylight is that it does have a very extensive collection of secondary things you can do that reward you with the kind of, Battle Pass content and more blood points. And again, it's something that you can say that I can focus on that is separate from whatever my ranking or MMR or ELO or anything like that you can think of. But oftentimes, the problem that developers have is when it comes to sustaining the PvP loop. Because again, PvP is very focused on what kind of gameplay it wants. It has to be something that will affect the competitive side. Introducing new skins is great, but it's not going to keep somebody who's hardcore, wants to be, the top 10 or obviously number 1 in the game. And this is one of the interesting reasons why we've seen this kind of subtle renaissance when it comes to the fighting game genre the past 10 years, and that has been carried largely by NetherRealm Games, who've worked on, again, the Mortal Kombat, Injustice, and what they've done is, yes, they have a very popular PvP and esports level content, but then they throw a lot of stuff in that is entirely divorced from that. Again, PvP players don't care about having an extensive story that's fully voice acted, but they did it for MK9, 10, and I believe 11, or certainly they did it for 11. And this kind of stuff, it does two things. It raises the inherent value of your game. Because if somebody is going to spend 40, 50, however many dollars on your game, they want to be able to experience as much of it as possible. And somebody who is not PvP focused can still get something out of MK11 with its extensive story and the additional content. The other thing it does is that it gives people who aren't PvP focused a way of learning this game, or maybe just playing it separate from that mode. With StarCraft 2, for instance, that you have the single-player campaign with its own rules and systems, you have the PvP side with its own rules, and never the two shall mix. And while that does help, it is kind of a band-aid fix. Because ultimately the goal of the PvP gameplay loop is that you want as many people as possible in that loop. Again, your games that have this focus live or die on their community. If you don't have enough people coming in and to replace the people who are dropping out, or just to keep this community growing, then you have effectively set a timer for how long your game has viability. Because if your game has nothing but hardcore players, the 10% or less or fewer who are the super hardcore and that's it, new players aren't going to be able to get in and be able to learn this game. And again, that also leads into a lot of discussions about effective onboarding and UI UX design. But with that said, I want to talk a little bit more about my thoughts and experiences with Dead by Daylight and why this game, being so PvP minded, is not working for me. And some of the lessons you have to take note of if you are designing a game around this loop. So we're going to do that after this quick break, but as always, if you're interested in my thoughts on design, then check these out. For entry-level students, we have 20 essential games to study, and then the Game Design Deep Dive series that takes an extensive look at different genres, with free-to-play coming in 2022. So, if you caught the streams in kind of late December and so, you probably saw me attempt to play Dead by Daylight. Actually, twice. The first time failing horribly, the second time actually winning every match I did that stream, and probably why I retired as champion shortly thereafter. But Dead by Daylight is very much an example of a game built on its PvP loop. And again, games that go this route will live and or die by it. And for me, I just didn't find the gameplay compelling enough. And more specifically, I didn't find the meta interesting. And meta design is kind of the unspoken arbiter of whether or not a PvP or competitive live service game is going to be able to survive long term. Now, for those of you new, when we talk about meta or metagame, what we're referring to is the popular trends or options that kind of build up or develop over the course of a game's life. The more solidified the meta is for a game, the worse the experience is going to be. Because when you have it be that rigid, it basically transforms a game into a game of everyone who runs the meta build and everyone who runs the counter to the meta build. And that's not good balance because it greatly reduces the choices and just the experience of playing the game. So when it comes to Dead by Daylight, we could have an entire 30-minute to an hour long discussion on the design of it, but the Cliff's Notes version is you have the two groups, killers and survivors. They both have their own unique perks, with the killers getting access to their own unique power, which kind of makes them more akin to the champions in like a MOBA or the unique characters in a class-based game like Team Fortress or Overwatch. And what has happened is that the meta around the game has really become rigid due to kind of, I would say, some inherent design flaws with Dead by Daylight's progression. So how it works is that long-term progression in this game is driven by perks. Every character that you can buy or acquire comes with 3 unique perks. Level that character up high enough, and those perks can start showing up on other characters. So the long end of kind of customization Dead by Daylight is getting or cultivating characters of the perks that you want to then attach to the character that you want to play as, or to the killer. And that in of itself is not a bad system. But the issue is that so many of the perks are just not created equal. Some are either too situational, some just don't fit anymore in terms of the meta or what's going to stop people from playing, and some are just so damn good for both sides that there's never a reason that you shouldn't take this one onto your character. As somebody who played as the killer enough times, I have seen so many survivors run with the perks of Dead Hard, Borrowed Time, Decisive Strike, and I believe it's called Sprint Burst or Iron Will. It's the one that basically gives them super enhanced speed for like the first few seconds of a run. And the problem is that when the meta solidifies like this, you're kind of either in or you're out. If you try to kind of go against the meta, you are going to be heavily punished for it. If you go kind of trying to work your way around the meta, that means greatly reducing the strategies and play styles of the game. And what I found was that despite running through as different killers, which kept things at least varied on my side, the survivors were still just largely doing the same thing. They've watched high-level players. They know what perks to take. They know what is considered, the quote-unquote best way to run. And the game space itself is not set up enough to provide variability. Essentially, when it comes to upsetting the meta in a PvP loop-focused game, there's only 2 areas where you can affect it. What happens during play, and what happens before play. When we talk about before play, this is setting up your character or your deck, or what strategies you're going to bring into the match itself. While the match itself, that's going to be stuff like, what are the conditions for winning? What effects are happening on the map? And that group is a lot harder to do in a lot of competitive focused games, because competition in these titles is usually built on very static maps. Most designers, especially of fighting games and strategy titles, try to keep things as symmetrical as possible. They want player group or player A to have the same resources and pathing that player B has. And that way, the map gets taken out of the equation and it's more about the player's skills. With a game like Dead by Daylight, however, it is asymmetrical. What the killer does is nowhere in relation to what the survivors do, and vice versa. So that means that the various skills and advantages between the two are different. But the problem is that when one side can basically, or only has, a very limited pool of powerful options, it forces the other side to play around that. When I tried out Gwent in the earlier versions of it, the monster weather strategy was kind of the de facto run for some time. Anyone who's played Hearthstone long term probably remembers the days of Miracle Rogue. And this is an issue for developers, and why you have to be very mindful of when the meta solidifies. There has to be enough elements to keep the game varied, because once that meta becomes kind of set, you're in trouble. And it means that new players are going to be running into things that they have no ways of defending against, and their only options are to either get lucky and get those meta perks, or end up getting frustrated and leave. And here's one of the points, because I know people, if this video does get, outside of my normal circles, I'm sure we're going to get hardcore defenders of Dead by Daylight coming in and throwing stuff like, you need to get good, you suck at the game, blah blah blah. And my response to that is very simple. Can you tell me, within your heart of hearts, that at least 50 to 60% of all the survivor perks and all the killer perks are competition viable? That you can take these perks and build something that can work in a competition setting. And you will never, or for the survivors, there will be a situation where you will never need to take those 4 perks that I mentioned before. And the reason why I say competitively viable is that when it comes to PvP focused games, YouTubers, streamers, high-level players, they are going to shout from their virtual rooftops, what are the best perks? What are the best characters? What is the meta of this game? And that will trickle down to everyone else. People don't want to play with the worst choices, or shall I say the quote-unquote worst choices. Because again, when it comes to designing stuff like this, it can become very subjective in most cases. But as a designer, you're going to have people who are going to tell the majority of your consumer base, okay, this is the worst option, this is the best option. And if your game has elements that are not competition viable or competitively viable, those are dead choices. So it doesn't matter if you have 500 champions or 800 cards or 200 perks that people can choose from. If your game only has 20, or let's say 30, because that's a lot of sizes for decks, but if there are only 30 options that people will argue are the best and most secure for competitive play, then your game is only 30 choices deep. And that is oftentimes not enough to spark or keep long-term interest in a PvP loop-minded title. Now, when it comes to map designs and things like that, that is its own unique can of worms, especially in Battle Royale style games, or again, titles where the character's ability to move or get around becomes a factor. Because you want to have things in the map that are random or that can be surprising, But at the same time, they shouldn't be so game affecting that it's a case of if person A spawns near structure or point of interest B, they now have a gigantic advantage. And this is again often why, for a lot of competitive mind games, they'll try to take the map or the playboard out of the equation as much as possible. But with a horror style game, again with Dead by Daylight generator focus, that's not entirely feasible. But again, for me, my problem is that I can try and experiment as many killers as I want. It's not changing what I'm doing match by match. And again, randomly placing things on the map, much like in a horror game or in a roguelike, doesn't create variance. If I run to the left and then search to the right in one map, searching to the right and running to the left on the next map is not really changing what I'm doing. And unfortunately, developers have kind of painted themselves into a corner, because at this point, the only options they have are to either completely rebalance the perks, bumping up the ones that need some extra help, or what they've been doing is just adding in more perks and kind of padding out the long-term grind. And while that certainly is great for the people who already have everything and they're looking for more, it just makes it far more punishing for new and kind of up-and-coming players to try and get into things. And it's not an easy answer to solve, but it is one that you need to consider if you are trying to build your game around a long-tail PvP loop. There has to always be a new champion or a new character or a new booster pack, because you need to keep the meta kind of in flow or in a state of flux. Because again, if you don't, people are going to get bored. And even the competitive players, the high levels who have hundreds of hours, or even thousands of hours in your game, they're going to start to get bored if if a match just basically devolves into one or two different situations again and again and again. So, to wrap things up, my question for those of you watching: can you think of PvP-focused gameplay loops that manage to sustain themselves, whether it is through new content or through balancing? And I'm especially interested in that one. Can you think of a PvP game that had a massive restructuring of its choices, characters, and balance that managed to end up being better for it in the end? Let me know in the comments down below, and be sure to check out my upcoming book on free-to-play design and mobile games coming later in 2022. Do all the liking and subscribing, and check back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where it's in there on science of games. Until next time, take care.